Hello, I'm Salome Asega. I have the honor and privilege of welcoming our first keynote lecturer. She is an artist and cultural worker I truly admire, and I'll read her bio. Thenmozhi Soundararajan is a Dalit American transmedia artist who believes story is the most important unit of social change. She has worked with communities around the world as a socially engaged artist for over 15 years. She is also the founder of Equality Labs, which is the first South Asian Dalit-led art startup dedicated to the end of caste apartheid, Islamophobia, and religious fundamentalism. Her work explores themes of speculative making, Dalit futurism, and caste liberation, while she works in metal, photography, film, and digital mediums. Her work has been recognized by the Producers Guild of America Diversity Program, the Museum of Contemporary Art, the Annenberg Innovation Center, Slam Dance, MIT Center for New Media Studies, Source Magazines, and the National Center for Humanities. She was an inaugural Robert Rauschenberg and Atlantic Fellow for Racial Equity. Please welcome Thenmozhi.
Good afternoon, everybody. It is such an honor and a privilege to be able to be at a conference where we get the pleasure of being able to dream with each other. We don't often get that pleasure, particularly at this moment in history when so many of us are being sentenced to die. And I think this is why there's such an urgency about being able to talk about speculative making in this time of unprecedented violence against our communities. So some of what I hope to do in my talk today is I'll talk a little bit about my art, but I'm really hoping that I can talk with you about your vision for what we need to do together as artists who are trying to think past these frontiers of violence. So for me, when I begin to talk about these things, it's a medicine, it's a type of ceremony, because too often violence breaks meaning, and we don't have the ability to be able to think about not only what we've survived, but what we want to thrive into. And so for me, whatever form of art that I've done, I always ask these three questions, and I want to see if these questions resonate with you when we get to the question and answer period. So the first question is, what does it mean to be a dreamer at the end of the world? And for me, when you are tender, when you are shy, when you are introverted, when you are troubled of the things around you, we often forget that dreamers are often the first to go in cultures of violence. But dreamers are always the ones that have the solutions. And so in many ways, as artists, we have to struggle to be vulnerable in this unprecedented time, but we also have to hold on to our ability to dream. And so this is one question that I always struggle and think through as I think about my work. I also think about why at this moment do we need a socially engaged practice of speculative making? And, you know, there's a lot of people who started to use the term socially engaged art. You know, those of us who are community organizers that were also artists have been making this kind of art for a long time. And our ancestors, of course, this is how they thrived in the face of colonization, Brahmanism, and white supremacy. And yet, I think that as we see more and more artists thinking about socially engaged practice as a viable and, in fact, a contrary alternative to simplifying arts practice, I think we have to ask ourselves, what does making itself do as an inquiry when we are told we no longer can dream? I also think we need to ask this very simple question about, can we imagine ourselves beyond oppression? And this is not an easy thing to think about, because in many ways, I think all of these questions together are really talking about what the nature of freedom is. And are we able to, in fact, live it, be it, dream it, when it is being denied to us materially? And for me, one of the reasons why I felt that there are many roles that I play as an activist in my community. I'm often an advocate, I'm often in the streets, but with my role as an artist and a socially engaged artist, what I'm doing is basically looking at the fact that the imaginary is one of the most crucial battlegrounds for freedom. And that's because many, many people can't fight for freedom because they can't imagine themselves to be free. So when we're at a conference like this one, the invitation is not just to think about one particular piece we might be working on or the immediacy of a particular project for a work. I think we need to think about the large-scale pictures of what we're trying to dream ourselves out of. And for me, this is where this conversation starts, helping our fellow members of our species, beginning to help them imagine themselves free. For me, this was a very personal battle because, as my bio, Salome shared, I am Dalit. Dalit refers to the people that were formerly known as untouchable. We were oppressed under Hindu scripture in caste apartheid, and we are one of the oldest oppressed peoples in the world. Now, when people hear that, they're like, oh, okay, it must be some small number of people. In fact, we're 300 million people in India alone. And when you are born as a Dalit, under the caste apartheid, you are basically sentenced into a caste that determines the whole of your life. It determines your spiritual purity, it determines your family's profession, and it determines and sentences you to an apartheid of separate schools, separate places of worship, and really separate destinies. Because we face an undue level of violence, and we have a proximity to both structural discrimination and, in the case of Dalit women, sexual violence as well. So when I began my work around caste, a lot of people started to know this work internationally through a campaign called Dalit Women Fight. And I worked on this art collaboratively with the All India Adi Karmach, which is the All India Dalit Women's rights organization. And we basically decided that we were going to take the marches that this organization had been doing across the country in India to hold perpetrators accountable and to also hold the Indian government accountable for allowing the culture of impunity that allowed for such horrible statistics that 2 out of 3 Dalit women face some form of caste-based sexual violence in their lives. And so as the artist, it was a dream project because I'm a survivor. I have survivors in my family. And so I made art like there was nobody's business. I was like, we're just gonna end this with this project and it's gonna happen. Which I think is how many, many speculative art projects happen at the face of violence. We think if we tell our story, that's enough. And in fact, I created a series of photographs that really told some of the pain and the grief that our communities hold. And when I look at this picture, I think about how this to me is the beauty of Dalit femininity. On one hand, you have such deep and enduring violence and grief, but you also have a sisterhood that says, you will not go in the darkness. We will hold you, and we have you, and we will survive. To witness that was everything. But what I was also struck by is that it actually was fundamentally shocking to me as an artist that no matter how good my camera work was, no matter how profound the images I captured, fundamentally, evidence does not matter to the imaginary of the predators. And this was so difficult for me to reconcile. And the project of Dalit Women Fight also coincided with the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States. And so we've all lived through that. How many messed up images of Black bodies being tortured and killed and maimed by police officers have we all seen? And how many hashtags that were deaths did we all spread? And how many of those actually led to convictions? So in many ways, I think as an artist working at this point of violence, I really was very crippled at this notion that we can tell our stories and still the predators won't care. And I think this was also coupled by the fact that when I was working and shooting on this project, we were shooting an incident with a survivor, and our team was attacked by the police. And when the police came to attack us, I actually couldn't say anything, because if I revealed my accent, they would know I was not from India, even though I'm of Indian descent. And so I was quiet while they were hitting me, and they broke my camera. And there's something about having to be quiet in the face of an attack that is deeply disturbing as an artist. And I think that, while this is the most severe form of this, there are so many times as women and non-binary and trans folks of color where we have to keep our mouth shut in order to function. But what that does to us creatively and what that does to our sense of possibility is unmentionable. And I think this is one of the things that made me really think that if we are asking artists to risk, and if we're asking artists to make at the point of violence, we also really have to talk not just about funding the art, but we also have to talk about funding the self-care. Especially when self-care is utterly necessary when existence, let alone your art, is also trauma. And I was lucky enough that when I came back and I had all these signs of PTSD, I had a mentor, Eve Ensler, who took me aside and said, you need help. And, I was that woman of color that was like, I don't need help. Like, we live through trauma. Trauma is like our DNA. But that's right. Trauma is in our DNA. And certain behaviors about how we cope might get us through an initial period of our life, but they hold us back to experiencing the whole of our life. And I often wonder what it would be like as artists if we didn't have to shape to our oppressors' tactics all the time. So as I began to start to think about how to heal from that experience and to work through my PTSD, I think one of the next areas that I started to kind of use speculative making to inquire around these issues of justice and freedom was I started to work with copper and materials, but also to make collages and imagine a different past for Dalit and Bahujan women, one that wasn't marked by colonialism and Brahmanism. And within that, this is one of the pieces that I made. It's from a series called Amma Ammachi, We Are Still Here, which stands for mother, grandmother. And what's interesting to me about this piece, and it really brings to mind the words of what Rashida just spoke about in her session before, is that when we start to affix our labels to words that have come out of, the white imperialist frame, whether it's time or future, the words themselves change in our remaking of it. And in this piece, I chose copper because copper was actually what the kings of India wrote their laws on. And their laws had all of the typical casteist and sexist things about who owned what and who owned whom. And of course, there's very little mention of women, let alone Dalit women at all. So what I did is I took those copper plates, and then in front of that, I put these images of colonial era photographs of Bahujan or caste-oppressed women. And those, again, are yet another frame of violence. And yet, somehow when I looked at these women across time, as a Dalit woman artist, I said to myself, I will never know what she thought. I will never know what her experience of both the violence of colonialism was and the violence of her context shaped by Brahmanism. And yet, no matter the lack that there is such a limit to our ability to have that conversation in the present, when I see her presence, and there's like 4 or 5 of these pieces, they stand outside of the violence that would have circumscribed them to anonymity. And so in making these pieces, I'm making copper plates or laws for Dalit women that allow us to exist outside of violence. So pieces like this for me are also another way that speculative making becomes an inquiry in terms of the possible, even into the past, where all possibilities have already passed for our ancestors. And I also think this goes back to me about this yearning, and I'm curious if other people share this as well, that I often yearn as an artist of color to create beyond the wake of oppression. And what I mean by that is that oftentimes our work has to be reactive to what people have said, but we don't just get to dream. So for example, when I was hearing about, Elon Musk and the SpaceX colonial project, the first thing I thought is, why are we using the term colonization yet again when we're talking about something that belongs not just to Earth, but to the universe? Why is that the only metaphor for exploration, is that we go back to that piece? But I also thought, man, I just feel like we're just about reconciling the bones of our ancestors and what these violent systems have done to us, and they're already beginning to scheme for the stars. And in some ways, this is also, I think, the demand that we have as speculative makers, is that while we're piecing together our trauma, while we're reconciling our past, we too also have to have schemes for the future. And we have to be able to have space to have schemes for the future. No one becomes a futurist working 4 jobs and having to hustle so many different gigs. If you've ever been to any of these futurist seminars, and I have, usually it's like rooms of white men in the first world, in air-conditioned spaces or places that are like, really beautiful landscapes, taken care of by people of color, and they just get to be paid to dream. But our dreams matter too. And I think being able to have a clarion call for our right to be there as participatory futurists is a call for equity that is crucial and that we cannot relinquish, even though things may be dire at this time. I also think that when we're talking about technology spaces, one of the things that struck me, particularly because I was one of the first Dalit women online, is that there was so much techno-utopianism about, if we just get online, things are going to change. And it's true, some things changed. I was, one of the first Dalit women online. Because I was out, many, many people came out. And in its turn, Dalit Twitter and Dalit Facebook has become a massive zeitgeist force in India, forcing accountability for the recognition of what's happened because of caste. But what we haven't really talked about is that all of our minority communities, whether it's women of color in the United States or caste-oppressed peoples in India, we were the canaries in the coal mine about how these platforms were being weaponized. And nobody would listen to us, even as we faced threat after threat after threat after threat. In my experience, like over the course of my work, I've had over 10,000 rape or death threats. And every time I complained, there was no process. And these were some of the things that, people would say about me on a routine basis. I actually learned things from the trolls, like as they, taught me. So in this one, so XIN is not a Chinese word. It's the slur that Hindu fundamentalists have come up with for Dalits, saying that we're Christian and therefore missionaries and therefore not Indian. And then sepoy is a term for Indians that collaborated with the British. So the idea is, similar to a dysfunctional family where you're not allowed to speak about the abuse that's happening, is that Dalits and other marginalized communities who speak about the issues of violence that we face, when we speak about them in international forums, we're betraying India, and therefore we're the sepoys, there to design to break the union. Another one is rice bag convert, and that's a term that Hindu fundamentalists use to say that we are only Christian because they gave us rice or we got access to schools, which in my family, it was true. No one in my family was educated until Christian missionaries actually built a school, because under caste apartheid, Dalits were not allowed to be educated. I, however, am not Christian, I'm Buddhist. But the fact that this is the go-to shows the level of religious violence that comes out any single time I create a piece of art. There's also this one, which just happened quite recently, which is, we understand your anti-India agenda, and yes, it's just the beginning. We will drag out anti-nationals and those working against the state to the streets. The rest will be seen public and in the open. So these are direct calls to violence, and I didn't show some of the worst calls to violence. And the fact that Dalit women experience such a porousness of violence in real life, it's not a big surprise that we'd face it online. But it is a problem when platforms make money off the violence that we experience. And our democracies are being destabilized because of these platforms. In many ways, when you look at what Facebook has done, Facebook has disrupted more democracies than the CIA. So we have to look at our role as digital practitioners about, are we really using the master's tools to free ourselves, or are we circumscribing ourselves into more patterns of violence? I don't have an answer to that, because obviously I'm online, and many of you are people who have engaged with. But I think that these are some of the larger questions we have to ask when we engage in a visionary project towards thinking about a speculative future that is just. I also think that as an artist, particularly when I got the Robert Rauschenberg Award, many people in that field really did not know what to do with the fact that so much of my work was under attack during the time that I had that fellowship. It was such an unprecedented experience that I had to work with the foundation to figure out what mode of practice would make sense for me, because every time I would create something, I would get attacked. And this is one of the reasons why, instead of making a studio, I developed the organization Equality Labs, because I felt to do socially engaged art and to confront the gender-based violence and the caste apartheid and the religious fundamentalism that we face in working on these issues in the South Asian context, we needed a new kind of organization where artists could be innovators, where artists could be advocates, where artists could directly look at their practice as part of a continuum of resistance. And this has really been one of the best parts of Equality Labs, is that we don't have to leave any of our identities at the door. In fact, we can be the cohesive, collective hive mind we need to be nimble around constantly volatile, violent environments. And I think that one of the things that Equality Labs was most successful in doing was that after the wake of the many digital attacks that we faced, we created a digital security curriculum that was used not only by Dalit women, but by organizers all around the United States. Because when Trump was elected, we were the only organization in the country that actually had women of color, Muslim, and South Asian digital security trainers. So overnight, we went from working within our community to working with the world. And I think this is another really great example in terms of thinking about what it means to be a speculative maker when you come from a specific context. A lot of times people think that your inquiry is small or not universal. But I actually think that the specific is always universal, and that for many of us who are those canary in the coal mine communities, when we look at our case studies, we are solving problems for liberation that not only free ourselves, but can free millions if people actually understood the innovation quotient that we're bringing to the problems that we face. And I think this is also one of the things that I think is a charge that we have as artists, is that we shouldn't let them box artists as solution makers only to the realm of our arts practice. In fact, some of the best problem solvers in the world are artists. And so we need to be a prominent stakeholder in any of the conversations for change. Otherwise, there is going to be no conversation for change. I also think that we need to have this conversation more urgently than ever, because we are now in a state of imagining for our very lives. And I think with the rise of Trump, what we saw is that there was a betrayal in many ways that people felt that again, this thing about evidence. We had so many communities of color speak out about what the experience of the Trump administration would be like. And yet, people did not listen to us. Our voice was silenced in the face of white supremacy. And I think that as we look now, the crisis that we face is the crisis of the white supremacist imagination. And that in many ways, we are facing the failure of white supremacy to believe that the rest of the world, that even the world itself matters. And I think when I look at that, I remember the first day of the election night. And I don't know, I'm sure everyone is always going to remember that horrific night, but I remember that around 10 o'clock, I knew that Hillary was going to lose. And the whole time that the election was happening, I was pacing back and forth like an animal. And I had diarrhea, I took a shower, I just was like, I could sense something terrible was going to happen. Kind of like how they talk about animals getting nervous around an earthquake. This too was going to be something that we would always remember as a defining point for our generation. And what's funny is that 3 days afterwards, I had a conversation with my friend Adrienne Marie Brown, and we were just crying on the phone to each other about the need to imagine more than ever. And I want to read you something that we wrote back and forth with each other that led to a call for an anthology that we're working on right now. And some of it was, right now, we are imagining now for our very lives. We are imagining back from the greatest crisis of our time, the failure of white supremacy to believe that the world itself matters. This is why our imagination is our greatest weapon. We must imagine ourselves beyond our socialization. Now more than ever, we need stories that can be our heartbeat, a North Star, a map to the way out of this mess. It is a call for freedom in a moment of pain. It is a radical dreaming. And I think these words, like we just kind of were scrambling and sending them to text back and forth with each other, they still hold true to me, and they're actually what holds me in dark times even now. That in many ways, we are all in an act of speculative making. We don't know how we are going to get out of this mess, but we are going to get out of it. Every day is an act of practice where we're figuring new relationships, new concepts, new ways of being that fall away as we see this world that they want, it's not going to happen. But we actually haven't had enough time to actually use our own imagining muscles to think about the world that we do want. So in this type of process, if we commit every day to imagine radically, imagine what would happen if everyone in this room did that. What would be some of the solutions we would see instead of just reacting to this guy? Right? Because you can start to get into an outrage cycle where it's all about him when actually it needs to be all about us. And I think that ability to shift that is very difficult. And that's something that Adrienne Marie Brown talks about in terms of attention liberation. Are we able to focus our attention on the things that liberate us as opposed to the things that continue to enslave us? And that might feel like a subtle difference, but it's actually when you start to put that into practice, it very much changes your view as an artist and really as a person living in these times. I also think when we look at this moment, particularly in light of some of the conversation of the previous panels, we have to look about how this moment is not just about white supremacy and Brahmanism and these other predator cultures, it is very much about patriarchy. And I think whether we look at Trump and his army of white men, or we look at the other global bad men, from Duterte to Bolsonaro to Modi, we know that this rise of authoritarianism is a reaction to feminist practice. And I think that when you have such a deep reaction to our successes, we should not be intimidated by the violence, but we should lean into the violence to say, we will make it stop and we will find another way. So for me, I learned that very deeply in terms of, I learned that very deeply because I was lucky enough to teach a class in the first month of the Trump administration with Patrick Jagoda at the Center for Inquiry and the Gray Center in Chicago. And it was the wildest experience of my life because basically, if you remember that first month, nobody knew what was going to happen after inauguration. And what they allowed me to do was every weekend I would be going to a different protest, and during the week I would be teaching art to different students that were also trying to make sense of this. And I always remember this one student, she came up to me and she was like, Thenmozhi, we thought we're millennials. We really thought that the worst thing we were gonna have to deal with is microaggressions, and now we have to deal with motherfucking dystopia. What the hell? I think we all felt that, But what was remarkable was, as an artist who's always been able to imagine, I just felt so paralyzed in arts practice in the beginning. And I think that we never gave people big picture questions, but what we did was every week we forced people to make. And I think that, and during the time of that first month, there was the Women's March, there was the Muslim ban, and I was part of all of those actions, particularly in the Muslim ban in San Francisco. I was one of the leaders of that process. And it was fascinating to see how incrementally the act of making helped to heal the trauma of that collective experience of Trump, but also, even though we didn't have the answers, making opened up inquiry. And so doing even small tasks, whether if it was drawing or performance, the process of it actually started to open up possibility. And I think this is where I would really encourage people who are socially engaged artists to think about the fact what is transformative about that work is not just the product, but the process itself. And you can decide what you want to leverage as you look at the problem you're trying to engage with in your work. And in that class, I learned very deeply, process was actually so deeply healing in a time when people had no way to think about what action could come next. I also think that, we also need to be able to ask for vision in a time of reactionary tactics. And, I say that as someone who does both, so I'm not saying I'm not going to be at the next march that happens at Trump Tower, which there I am, with a sign that I created with my team. But I also think that we have to be able to ask for more and ask for us to go beyond rapid response. Because in many ways, rapid response demands that we must always be in crisis because it assumes that we cannot fundamentally change the foundations of society. And this is an inherently limiting frame. So whether you're an artist or an advocate or a community organizer, too much of the funding in our fields limits us to only reactionary practice. And I think what we need to do as a society, and for artists in here that are bold dreamers, is to demand more. We actually can solve some of the greatest problems of our time if we were in the visionary table instead of the smaller, less funded reactionary table. And those of you who are artists of color, you know exactly what I mean. But I think that to be able to ask for vision and to say that we are the ones that we've been waiting for is a call many, many generations of organizers have made. And I think we need to continue to make it, and make it not just in terms of our words, but with the art that we create and invoke. I also think that we need to be able to lead with love. And this is so hard in a politics of violence, in a politics of genocide, and a politics of hate crime. But when I think about love, I think less about loving people who have oppressed me, because I think that's something that is, predicates a whole process of where we've gone through some sort of transformative justice engagement with each other, but I think about the love that sustains us, the communities that have allowed us to be here. So for example, with me, I'm Dalit, and my caste name is Pariyan. Pariyan actually gave birth to the word pariah that we use in English, because the English saw how badly that upper caste people were treating my people, and they were like, dude, that's really bad. Okay, pariah, because the English never can translate words properly. But when I think about the fact our caste actually started in the 13th century, and I think about my foremothers back then, they would never, ever experience freedom in their lifetime. They would never even know that their daughters would have freedom in their lifetime. But somewhere, someone felt that freedom was still a possibility. And hope, even though it could not be physically manifest, became a micro-expression in the mind. And so from ancestor to ancestor, people kept dreaming about the possibility that actually led to me and my sister. And when I think about what that required, there was so much struggle, so much endurance, but also such a deep level of love. And when I think about my mother, I just know that she loved me so much. She loves me still, and she sacrificed so much for me to be able to speak whatever I could speak today. That I could marry whoever I wanted to marry, and that I could live a life without violence. That love is a transformative politic that is going to destroy every single foundation of predator culture that you can imagine. Because the women that did that, they can change the world because they changed the world already by having us. I also think that we need to have joy. Because this is like, I used to have a sci-fi rock band because obviously there needed to be Bollywood sci-fi rock. But I also think that oftentimes we get so grave and so serious about the things around us that we forget that there's joy and wonder. And I think that when we begin to create our speculative visions, we do want to take on the problems that we face, but we also want to be able to find play, because play also allows us to find meaning where violence has broken our communities. And so whether it's something like this, or there was a project I did that was like a Bollywood, a sci-fi Bollywood rock opera, these are the things that allow us to find levity in a time of darkness. I also wanted to bring up this piece, which, many people may not recognize that image of the man in the glasses, but his name is Dr. Ambedkar, and he is a fundamentally important Dalit leader and really resistance leader within the Indian context. And if you've never heard about him, just research him. He's incredible. He's the equivalent of the Indian Thomas Jefferson and Malcolm X, because he not only wrote the Indian Constitution, he was also one of the first Indians to study abroad and actually went to Columbia and was the first Dalit and one of the first Indians to study there. But he also was our great revolutionary leader when it came to caste. And he led many, many, many thousands of Dalits on resistance marches to caste apartheid, asking for the desegregation of water tanks and roads and common facilities, where even after untouchability was illegal in the Indian government, upper caste people still treated us like shit. And yet this man found dignity and possibility, and his dream not only transformed the lives of millions of Dalits, it transformed the entire nation. And I think now, for us as caste-oppressed peoples, this image seems so hopeful. Because, of course, like when most people think of Dalit, they think of someone poor, they think of someone impoverished, they think of violence, they think of atrocity. They don't think of success. They don't think of future possibilities. They don't think about ways that we might engage with the moon or the stars that would not involve colonialism and Brahmanism. And yet, I think that's actually why this image is so radical, is that for us, if we take to the stars, what would we actually change in turn? And that's some of what I hope that we can talk about and look at when we get to our question and answer period. So with that, I want to open up to questions and comments, because again, when we go back to those questions I asked in the beginning, I'm curious for the makers and the critics and the artistic critics in the space, you know, how do you grapple with those questions that I started with? Again, what does it mean to be a dreamer at the end of the world? 2, why do we need a socially engaged speculative practice? And also, can we imagine ourselves beyond depression? So, you know, I'm open and would love to hear your thoughts.
Thank you for that. We encourage folks to submit their questions at rtfq@ibeam.org. In the meantime, we have runners in the audience who can take any questions. So is there anyone out there who has a question?
Hi, thank you so much, and thank you also to the earlier panelists. The question I have, I thought about when I was listening to Rashida about Black quantum futurisms, and this is sort of this idea of the weaponization of time, which Jackie Wang also talks about. And I think for all of us living in this hyper-capitalist, whatever we want to call it, right? The thing that none of us seem to have is time. Maybe on just on a personal level, how do you find that time? How can we now create the space to think and to dream on our own, together?
Well, it's interesting because, you know, the time was a very fundamental part of my family's practice in that, you know, my grandmother, she was discovered by missionaries, you know. So what I mean by that is she was 13, and when the missionaries would come to the village areas that she was at, they would ask the girls to sing, and from that they would pick promising people that they would try to develop. And so, you know, my grandmother impressed them with her song and her, you know, her presence. You know, she was bossy even back then. And when they took her into the missionary school. And when she came back out, she was one of the first teachers in our village. People always remarked that she was dictatorial about time. And I always thought about time, in colonial time, as being missionary time. Is that the difference between village time and what the missionaries did was that everything ran to a clock. And people always, you know, even her name was Nesa Money, and money in Tamil means time. And so you always kind of knew she was like tick, 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 tick. That's like kind of how you always she reminded me, I always think about when I think about her. But I feel like the grappling of her experience of time really contrasts, I think, with the lineage of depression that exists in my family. And if anyone has ever suffered from depression, I'm someone who suffers from depression. Time becomes endless. It becomes torturous. It becomes violent. And you also get stuck in a loop where you can't see past your present because it's so painful. It is so grief-stricken. And I think that some of what you mentioned is the ways out of thinking of supremacist visions of time, which is building community, building intentionality, building possibility, and building love with each other. All of those things also feel timeless. And I think that being able to start to moving ourselves, circumscribing ourselves outside of the calendar, but more in terms of relationality with each other, and also relationality with the earth, I think is really powerful. Because the other thing that's also very true in terms of my family context is my family was all farmers. And it's really funny, like when you know, even though my parents are doctors now, they're so connected to the land. And, you know, the cycles of what you eat, the spices of what we could have, especially as Dalit peoples, we were not allowed to eat the food of the Brahmins. Our cuisine is so distinctly different, so much earthier and material, because we tilled it, you know, we suffered the violence of it. We were sharecroppers on upper caste landlords' lands. And so I think that the way that your body cycles with the nature of the earth and the cycles of your crop, those also bring a different nature of rhythm than something that's about, you know, master's time. You know, I think of it as like this, as opposed to something that's like circular and ebbs and also builds with connection and more meaning.
I'm a documentary filmmaker. I think about empathy, and I'm doing a documentary called The State of Empathy, and I'm wondering what you think about empathy as what is missing in our society, and how we can get to have a more empathetic society.
Well, I think that we could always have more empathy in society, for sure. And I often feel that marginalized communities, particularly women of color, are often expected to have an overwhelming amount of empathy for people that are oppressors. But I don't necessarily see it as an empathy gap that troubles our society, because that assumes that people that are benefiting off the exploitation of people are doing so because of feelings. I actually think they're doing so because they benefit off that exploitation, and they're not willing to look at the blood that underlines their economic and political choices that they're making. And empathy can definitely humanize those choices, but I think that's also what I was so struck by in terms of my work with Dalit Women Fight and with Black Lives Matter, is that even when provided the human perspective, the human voice, the actual person that became a body in the act of violence of white supremacy or caste apartheid, empathy was not the problem. It wasn't an empathy gap. I really think it's about the fact that people that are privileged have a very hard time letting go of that privilege and don't want to be confronted with the bodies that they create in the wake of that. So I have not actually pursued that line of thought, because as someone I've always been put into positions of where I have to have empathy for people that have been violent towards me or my community. And I think that in some ways I've done that so much that I no longer find that as a useful tactic anymore.
Hi, I once met an Indian. He was wearing a T-shirt and it said, "We gave you nothing, don't forget it." And I understood what he was talking about, and he appreciated, because we give the Arabs credit for the null set, and nothing is a big deal, and we wouldn't be talking here, and nothing would be happening without nothing. And Indians have given something else very important. It's the Atman Brahman concept, which is in the Upanishads, which I read when I was 16. And you know the concept of Atman Brahman, the little self and the great self, and we share in a common self. It's the basis for empathy. And I just thought, as an Indian, and I don't know if you were a missionary, whether they were converted, are you familiar with that concept and the implications of that concept? Because there's a quote in the Upanishads, and it says, if you understand the discipline of service, you understand in serving another, truly, you serve yourself. And that's the basis of empathy. That's the basis of social action and why it matters. It matters to you if you know who you are. So that's the question. Are you familiar with that quote and the whole concept of the Atman Brahman?
So I wouldn't be I wouldn't be able to speak with expertise about the Indian context, especially with the process of Hindu scripture, if I wasn't familiar with the concepts that you shared. But I also want to point out, this is always what happens when Dalit people speak, is that we are never allowed to speak to our own context. We are always referred to our oppressor's wake and have to be referred back to Hindu scripture. And I refuse to actually engage in that mode of thinking because for me, Hindu scripture actually, it destroyed our people. It destroyed so many of the possibilities for centuries. And I know that there are people who find meaning in books like the Bhagavad Gita and the Upanishads, but every act of Hindu scripture has done nothing but bring violence and pain and misery for centuries for my ancestors. And I don't find meaning in that work. And I don't think it's a useful practice for, especially a Dalit artist, to have to speak to that. One last question or comment, because I know there's a lot of artists here. So if there's any comments too, I'd love to engage too.
Yes, thank you so much for your presentation. It's extremely meaningful and resonant. And I just would like you to maybe extrapolate on the idea that all of this kind of wraps around what is your experience in reality, and how all over the world there are different realities and different perspectives, and how do we put that all together and really move forward as artists and human beings and global citizens to create a more hopeful and better reality as much as a future?
Well, I think of, again, like with speculative making, I think there's so much possibility in both looking as art as both process and inquiry, process and product. And, there was this story by Borges about, I think it's called like The Forgotten God, where there's pieces of God that have been like, thrown across the world. And it was the duty of, the narrator to put the pieces of God back together again. And I think that's part of the practice, I think, as oppressed artists, artists from oppressed backgrounds, that in some ways, I don't think that we're going to ever create a universal understanding of the world with a capital U. But I think in being able to share with each other our individual specific practice, we uncover that which has been broken by colonialism, white supremacy, and in the context of caste, Brahmanism has broken in our people. And those moments of specificity where we find resonance and connection make us larger than ourselves, and we also uncover pieces of ourselves we didn't have words for. And I think that in many ways, if we can create collaboratively, if we can learn from each other with empathy, but also be able to build projects that link the marginalized people from these different oppressive projects, we will start to see that other vision of the world that is calling out to us. I don't think that there's a big future. I think there's a future that holds many futures. And we need to be able to have room enough in that many-futured world to be able to hear what have we survived as oppressed peoples, and what do we want to build and grow to, and what kind of solidarity economies, solidarity aesthetics, and solidarity processes that we can create and learn from. So, for example, I think that one thing when a lot of artists who first work with me for the first time learn is they go through a process of decolonizing themselves from Brahminical ideas. So, in many movement classes, people will often use yoga practice or yoga terms. And, oftentimes yoga for caste-oppressed people is a very violent practice because, one, you're chanting Sanskrit. And Sanskrit is a language that in Hindu scripture, if we spoke as caste-oppressed people, our tongues would be cut off. Or if we listened to it, lead would be poured in our ears. So using that as a way to move the body and yoga practice to allow it to be in flow, it immediately stops us from being able to create a solidarity practice with each other. So having conversations like that that describe some of the limits and the grief that we have as communities and creators, I think help us then build proactively that other vision of the world, because we have the courage to let go that which is unnecessary, that which has like kept us from each other, to be able to build that new space through the imaginings we have of both process and product. Is there time for one more question? Are we wrapping? Okay, one more question.
Hi, my name is Mikanaya Faine. Visiting here from Oregon. I just want to take a moment to thank you for so much of what you said. I'm sitting here with my sister, and we're just resonating with it a lot. We're first-generation Ethiopians, and a lot of my work intersects with what you've been doing. And I missed the first part of your talk, but something that I really struggle with is the way in which the fetishization of brown women's suffering takes place. I'm in the academy right now. I'm sort of crossing over into the art world. And I just think it's amazing. I'm learning a lot from your work and how to sort of stand on that edge and bring attention from the perspective, and I'll use transnational feminism as kind of the lens here, but to talk about and make art about and work through your feelings about the things that have happened in your own country without it necessarily being for this audience that seems to take that and then sort of use it to justify a lot of reactionary political and humanitarian actions. And so it's more just a comment. I just want to thank you, and just you've left us a lot to think about and use in my own work, and I hope that we can continue the conversation in the future. So thank you.
Thank you, everybody. And J. Beam!